Exactly 9 days before our wedding, my fiancé looked me in the eyes and said, "I'm sorry, but I can't marry you." At first, I thought he was nervous. Then he reached into his pocket, handed me my engagement ring, and admitted he was leaving me for another woman. A woman nearly 20 years older than us who owned a luxury real estate company worth millions. Just like that, 12 years together disappeared in a single conversation. I spent the next week canceling the venue, returning wedding gifts, and explaining to over 200 guests why there would be no wedding. Meanwhile, social media was filled with photos of my ex flying on private jets, vacationing on yachts, and smiling beside the woman he claimed was his soulmate. Everyone told me I'd never recover from that kind of heartbreak. They were wrong. I rebuilt my life one day at a time, stopped waiting for an apology that would never come, and finally found peace. Then, exactly 1 year later, on the evening of what should have been our first wedding anniversary, someone knocked on my front door. I opened it and froze. My ex-fiancé stood there in the pouring rain, looking thinner, exhausted, and completely broken. His expensive suits were gone, his luxury watch had disappeared, and his eyes were filled with tears. Before I could say a single word, he dropped to his knees on my front porch and whispered, "Rachel, I made the biggest mistake of my life. Please, forgive me." What happened next changed both of our lives forever. My name is Rachel Bennett, and I'm 31 years old. I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina, in a family that believed love was built through loyalty, honesty, and showing up for the people you care about every single day. My parents had been married for over 35 years, and even though they weren't wealthy, they always seemed happy together. I wanted the same kind of marriage. I wasn't looking for a perfect life. I just wanted a partner who would choose me every day. I met Ethan Collins when we were both 19 years old during our sophomore year of college. We started as friends, spending long evenings studying together at the campus library before slowly falling in love. Ethan was funny, ambitious, and always made me believe that no matter how difficult life became, we'd face it together. After graduation, we moved into a small apartment, worked full-time jobs, and saved every extra dollar we could. We celebrated promotions with takeout pizza, spent weekends dreaming about the house we'd someday buy, and often talked about the family we hoped to have. When Ethan proposed on the lakeside walking trail where we'd had our first date, I didn't hesitate for a second. I said yes before he even finished asking the question. The following 18 months became a whirlwind of wedding planning. My mother helped me choose the perfect dress, my best friend Emily organized my bridal shower, and my father proudly told everyone he met that his little girl was finally getting married. We booked a beautiful vineyard venue, mailed invitations to more than 200 guests, and counted down the days together. Every detail felt like another step toward the future we'd spent over a decade building. Looking back now, I realized there were small signs that something had changed. Ethan started working late more often, became strangely protective of his phone, and seemed distracted whenever I talked about the wedding. Whenever I asked if everything was okay, he'd smile, kiss my forehead, and tell me he was just stressed about work. I believed him because trusting him had never been difficult. After 12 years together, it never crossed my mind that the man I'd loved for most of my adult life was quietly preparing to walk away from everything we'd built. I thought I was planning the happiest day of my life. I had no idea I was only days away from the most heartbreaking conversation I'd ever have. 9 days before our wedding, I came home early from work carrying a folder filled with seating charts, final vendor invoices, and a list of last minute details. I was actually excited because everything was finally coming together. The flowers had been confirmed, the cake was paid for, and my wedding dress had passed its final fitting. I remember walking through the front door with a smile, calling out, "Ethan, you're never going to believe it. We actually finished everything." He didn't answer. I found him sitting alone in the living room, staring at the engagement photo hanging above the fireplace. His suitcase was standing beside the couch. At first, I thought he was leaving for another business trip. Then I noticed my engagement ring lying on the coffee table. My stomach dropped. Before I could ask what was happening, he looked at me with tears in his eyes and quietly said, "Rachel, I'm sorry, I can't do this." I laughed nervously because I honestly thought he was joking. "Can't do what? The wedding?" He nodded. "I can't marry you." My smile disappeared. "Is this some kind of cold feet joke?" He slowly shook his head. "No." My heart started pounding so hard I could barely hear my own voice. "Then tell me what's going on." He lowered his eyes and whispered, "I've met someone else." The room felt like it was spinning. "What?" "Her name is Victoria." I stared at him, unable to process the words. "You're cheating on me?" He nodded once. "For how long?" There was a long silence before he answered. "About 4 months." 4 months. While I'd been choosing invitations, tasting wedding cakes, and writing my vows, he had been building a relationship with another woman. Tears filled my eyes. "Who is she?" He took a deep breath. "She owns a real estate company I've been consulting for." I knew exactly who he meant. Victoria Harrington was one of the wealthiest businesswomen in the state, nearly 50 years old, divorced twice, and worth tens of millions of dollars. I'd even met her once at Ethan's company Christmas party. She'd smiled at me, complimented my dress, and wished us luck on our wedding. I looked back at Ethan in disbelief. "You're leaving me for Victoria Harrington?" He didn't deny it. Instead, he quietly said, "She can give me a life I could never have with you." Those words hurt more than the affair itself. After 12 years together, he had reduced our entire relationship to money. I felt tears running down my face, but I refused to let him see me fall apart. "So that's it?" I asked. "You're throwing away 12 years because she has a bigger house and a bigger bank account?" He looked ashamed, but didn't argue. "I'm sorry." I laughed through my tears. "No, you're sorry because you're leaving. You weren't sorry while I was planning our wedding." He picked up his suitcase and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he turned around one last time. "I hope one day you'll understand." I looked him straight in the eyes and said the last words I ever expected to say to the man I was supposed to marry. "I understand perfectly. You didn't choose love, you chose money. I hope it was worth it." Without another word, he walked out the front door, got into his car, and drove away. I stood in the silent living room staring at the engagement ring still sitting on the coffee table, realizing that in less than 10 minutes, the future I'd spent 12 years building had completely disappeared. The weeks after Ethan left were some of the darkest of my life. Instead of walking down the aisle, I spent my days canceling contracts, returning decorations, and explaining to friends and relatives why there wouldn't be a wedding after all. Every phone call reopened the wound. Some people were kind and supportive. Others couldn't hide their curiosity, asking if there had been another woman or if we'd simply grown apart. I never told them the whole truth. It was too painful to say out loud that the man I'd loved for 12 years had decided someone else's wealth was worth more than our future together. I focused on surviving one day at a time. Then the photos started appearing online. At first, I tried to ignore them, but they were impossible to escape. Friends accidentally mentioned them. Coworkers whispered about them. Even social media seemed determined to remind me. Ethan and Victoria were everywhere, stepping off private jets, attending charity galas in designer clothes, relaxing on a luxury yacht in the Caribbean, and smiling outside a mansion overlooking the ocean. Every caption talked about new beginnings, living your best life, and finding the courage to follow your heart. It felt like they were celebrating on the ruins of everything we'd built together. One afternoon, my best friend Emily came over carrying pizza and ice cream. She quietly took my phone, unfollowed every account connected to Ethan, and blocked the gossip pages that kept showing his photos. "You can't heal if you keep reopening the wound," she said. She was right. That evening, I made a promise to myself. I would stop watching his life and start rebuilding my own. I threw myself into my career, accepted a promotion I'd been too afraid to pursue before, started taking weekend hiking trips, and even signed up for pottery classes just to force myself out of the house. Little by little, I stopped waking up wondering why I wasn't enough. I realized the problem had never been my worth, it had been Ethan's priorities. Still, every now and then, I'd hear another story. Victoria had bought him a brand new sports car. They had moved into her multi-million-dollar estate. He'd left his old job to become an executive at her company. From the outside, it looked as though he'd won the perfect life. People who didn't know the truth probably envied him. They saw the expensive vacations, luxury watches, tailored suits, and glamorous parties. They didn't see what I eventually learned from someone who worked at Victoria's company. Ethan wasn't her equal. He was completely dependent on her. Every promotion, every expensive gift, every opportunity came from her money. The ambitious, independent man I'd once admired had become someone who couldn't make a single major decision without asking for permission. And while I was slowly rediscovering my confidence, he was quietly losing his freedom. I didn't know it yet, but the glamorous life he traded everything for was already beginning to fall apart. I'd continue the story like this. Exactly 1 year later, I woke up expecting the day to be difficult. According to my calendar, it should have been my first wedding anniversary. Instead of spending it on a honeymoon or celebrating with my husband, I poured myself a cup of coffee, looked out the window of my new apartment, and realized something surprising. I wasn't heartbroken anymore. The date still carried memories, but it no longer carried pain. Over the past 12 months, I'd earned a promotion to senior project manager, made new friends, completed my first half marathon, and even bought a small townhouse with a white front porch that I decorated myself. For the first time in years, my happiness didn't depend on anyone else. That evening, after work, Emily came over with takeout, determined to keep me from spending the night thinking about the past. We laughed, watched an old comedy, and talked about everything except Ethan. As she was leaving, she hugged me and smiled. "I'm proud of you," she said. "A year ago, I was worried you'd never smile again." I smiled back. So was I. Around 9 o'clock, a heavy rainstorm rolled across the city. Thunder echoed outside as I made myself a cup of tea and settled onto the couch with a book. Then the doorbell rang. I frowned. I wasn't expecting anyone. Assuming it was a delivery driver at the wrong address, I opened the front door without much thought. My breath caught in my throat. Standing on my porch, soaked from head to toe, was Ethan. I barely recognized him. The confident man who had left me for a millionaire was gone. His designer suits had been replaced by a wrinkled jacket that looked several years old. His expensive watch was missing. Dark circles surrounded his eyes, and he looked as though he hadn't slept in days. Before I could speak, he lowered his gaze and quietly said, "I know I have no right to ask this, but can you please give me 5 minutes?" I folded my arms. "Why are you here?" His voice cracked. "Because I lost everything." I stared at him without saying a word. He swallowed hard before continuing. "Victoria ended our relationship 6 months ago. After that, she fired me from the company. The house wasn't mine. The cars weren't mine. Even the bank accounts were in her name. When she was done with me, I walked away with one suitcase." Rainwater dripped from his clothes onto my porch. "I thought money would make me happy," he whispered. "Instead, I lost the only person who ever loved me for who I was." He slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out something wrapped in a handkerchief. When he unfolded it, I saw the engagement ring I'd left on the coffee table the day he walked out. Tears filled his eyes. "I kept it every single day," he said. "Not because I deserved another chance, but because I never stopped regretting the day I threw our future away." Then, to my complete shock, Ethan dropped to his knees in the pouring rain. "Rachel," he whispered, "I made the biggest mistake of my life. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking for it anyway. Please, if there's even the smallest chance, let me spend the rest of my life earning back the trust I destroyed." I looked at the man I'd once planned to marry. A year earlier, I would have given anything to hear those words. Now I wasn't sure they meant anything at all. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. Rain poured from the roof of my porch, and Ethan remained on his knees, holding the engagement ring in his trembling hand. A year ago, seeing him like this would have shattered me. Now, all I felt was sadness for the man he had become. I didn't see the confident, ambitious person I'd fallen in love with at 19. I saw someone who had spent the last year chasing a dream that had turned into a nightmare. "Stand up," I said quietly. He looked at me with red, exhausted eyes. "Please, just let me explain." I stepped aside and held the door open. 5 minutes, that's all." Ethan slowly walked inside, carefully removing his wet shoes at the door like he used to. For a brief moment, it felt strangely familiar, but the feeling disappeared as quickly as it came. This wasn't our home anymore. It was mine. I handed him a towel and pointed toward the kitchen table. "Sit down." He thanked me softly and wrapped the towel around his shoulders. His eyes wandered around the room, noticing the framed family photos, the fresh flowers on the table, and the peaceful life I'd built without him. "You've done well," he said. "I had to." I placed a cup of hot coffee in front of him, but didn't sit beside him. Instead, I remained across the table, leaving a distance that hadn't existed between us before. "You said you had 5 minutes," I reminded him. "Start talking." Ethan stared into his coffee before speaking. The life I thought I wanted wasn't real. Victoria never loved me. To her, I was another project, another person she could control. He admitted that after moving into her mansion, every part of his life had been dictated by her. She chose his clothes, decided which friends he could see, monitored his spending, and even expected him to cut ties with his own family because she believed they were beneath their new lifestyle. At first, he convinced himself it was worth the sacrifice because he was surrounded by luxury, but the expensive cars, private jets, and lavish vacations couldn't hide the loneliness he felt. "I gave up everything for money," he said, his voice shaking. "Then I realized none of it belonged to me." He explained that when Victoria discovered he had questioned one of her business decisions, she fired him on the spot, changed the locks on the mansion, canceled his company credit cards, and had his belongings packed into boxes by her assistants. 24 hours later, he whispered, I was sleeping in a cheap motel wondering how I had destroyed my own life. I listened without interrupting. He wasn't asking for sympathy. He was confessing. Finally, he looked directly at me. "Rachel, I know I don't deserve another chance. I know I broke your heart in the worst possible way. I'm not asking you to pretend it never happened. I'm only asking if someday, maybe, you could forgive me." I took a slow breath before answering. "Ethan, forgiving you and taking you back are two very different things." His shoulders dropped because he understood exactly what I meant. "Can I ask you one question?" I said. He nodded immediately. "If Victoria had never left you, would you be standing here tonight?" The room fell silent. Ethan opened his mouth to answer, but no words came out. And in that silence, I already had my answer. Ethan lowered his head and covered his face with his hands. Nearly a full minute passed before he finally looked up at me again. His eyes were filled with shame. "No," he admitted quietly. "If Victoria had never left me, I probably wouldn't be here." Hearing those words hurt, but they also gave me something I hadn't had in over a year, complete honesty. "Thank you," I said softly. "That's the first completely truthful thing you've said to me tonight." Tears rolled down his face, I know. He took a deep breath before continuing. "But that's not the whole truth." I folded my arms and waited. "When I met Victoria, I wasn't unhappy with you. I wasn't looking to replace you. I was insecure." I frowned. "Insecure?" He nodded. "I spent years comparing myself to people who had more money, bigger houses, nicer cars, and successful businesses. Every time I looked at social media or attended corporate events, I felt like I was falling behind." He gave a bitter laugh. "Instead of appreciating the life we were building together, I became obsessed with the life I thought I deserved." He admitted that Victoria had noticed those insecurities almost immediately. She praised his ambition, promised she could open doors no one else could, and convinced him he was destined for something bigger. At first, he insisted their relationship was strictly professional. Then came private dinners, expensive gifts, exclusive business trips, and constant reminders that he could have a life of luxury if he stopped settling. "She never asked me to leave you," Ethan confessed. "She didn't have to. She just made me believe I deserved more." I looked at him in disbelief. "More than 12 years with someone who loved you." He wiped away another tear. "That's what I was too blind to see." He explained that once he moved into Victoria's world, he realized every relationship around her was transactional. People stayed close because of her money, influence, or connections. Nobody trusted anyone. Every conversation felt like a negotiation. Every friendship had a price. "For months I kept waiting to feel successful," he said. "Instead, I felt emptier every single day." Then he reached into his jacket pocket and placed a folded envelope on the table. "What's this?" I asked. "A letter I wrote 6 months ago." I opened it carefully. It wasn't addressed to me, it was addressed to himself. In the letter, Ethan admitted that he had traded genuine love for temporary luxury, and that every expensive possession reminded him of the family, home, and future he'd destroyed. At the bottom, he had written one sentence that caught my attention. "The richest woman in the room couldn't give me what the woman I left gave me for free, peace." I quietly folded the letter and placed it back on the table. "Why didn't you come sooner?" I asked. Ethan sighed. "Because I knew I wasn't asking for forgiveness, I was asking to escape the consequences of my own choices." He looked directly into my eyes. "I spent 6 months rebuilding my life before I came here. I got a regular job, rented a tiny apartment, paid off every debt I could, and started seeing a therapist. I needed to become someone I could respect again before I asked you to respect me." His voice cracked. "Rachel, I don't expect another chance. I only wanted you to know that losing you finally forced me to become the man I should have been all along." I believed he meant every word. The problem was, believing his regret wasn't the same as believing in our future. After that night, Ethan didn't call or text me for several days. I assumed our conversation had given him the closure he needed, and honestly, I hoped it had. Then, the following Monday morning, I found a small bouquet of white daisies sitting on my front porch. There was no grand arrangement of expensive roses, no flashy gift basket, and no jewelry. Just my favorite flowers and a handwritten note that read, "No expectations, no pressure. I just wanted to say thank you for listening." There wasn't even a signature because he knew I would recognize the handwriting. I smiled sadly, placed the flowers in a vase, and went to work. A week later, another note arrived. This time, there were no flowers, just a simple envelope. Inside was a check made out to my parents for the full amount they had lost on our canceled wedding. My father had quietly paid several non-refundable deposits without ever asking Ethan for reimbursement. Along with the check was another handwritten note. "I should have done this a year ago. Please don't send it back. It's a debt I've owed for far too long." My father accepted the money but told me, "Paying what he owes doesn't erase what he did." I agreed. Over the next several months, Ethan never once asked to take me to dinner or pressured me into seeing him. Instead, he quietly focused on making amends wherever he could. He apologized personally to my parents for humiliating our family. He returned every wedding gift he still had stored in his apartment. He even volunteered on weekends at a local food bank after learning that community service had become part of his therapy goals. Mutual friends occasionally mentioned seeing him there, but he never told them to tell me. He wasn't performing for an audience. He was trying to become a better person whether I noticed or not. One Saturday afternoon, I unexpectedly ran into him at a neighborhood farmer's market. He was carrying groceries and looked surprised to see me. "Hi, Rachel," he said with a small smile. "Hi, Ethan." An awkward silence followed before he pointed to a nearby coffee stand. "Would you let me buy you a cup of coffee? No expectations, just two people talking." I hesitated before agreeing. We sat outside for nearly an hour discussing work, family, books, and life. For the first time in years, he didn't try to impress me. He didn't talk about money, success, or luxury. He simply listened. As we stood to leave, he looked at me with quiet sincerity. "I'm not trying to win you back by buying gifts or making speeches," he said. "I know trust isn't rebuilt with words. It's rebuilt with time and consistent actions." He paused before adding, "Whether you ever love me again isn't something I can control. All I can control is becoming someone worthy of the forgiveness I'm asking for." I appreciated his honesty, but deep inside, I still carried a question I couldn't ignore. Was Ethan truly fighting for me? Or was he simply trying to ease the guilt of losing the best thing he'd ever had? Until I knew the answer, my heart refused to take another step forward. I'd end the story's climax like this. A few weeks after our unexpected coffee, Ethan called and asked if we could meet one last time. "Just once," he said. "After that, I'll respect whatever decision you make." I agreed because I knew I couldn't keep living with unanswered questions. We met at the same lakeside park where he had proposed to me 12 years earlier. It was a cool autumn afternoon, and the trees were painted in shades of red and gold. As I walked toward the bench overlooking the water, I saw Ethan already waiting. He wasn't carrying flowers. There was no ring in his pocket and no rehearsed speech. He simply stood when he saw me and smiled nervously. "Thank you for coming," he said. We spent nearly an hour talking about everything that had happened over the past year. For the first time since our breakup, the conversation felt completely honest. Then Ethan looked at me and asked the question I knew was coming. "Rachel, is there any chance we could start over?" I looked out across the lake before answering. "Can I ask you one last question?" He nodded immediately. "If I had lost my job, if I had become sick, if life had become difficult for me instead of you, would you have stayed?" Ethan didn't answer right away. Tears filled his eyes as he whispered, "Today, yes. The man I was back then, probably not." I appreciated the honesty, but his answer also gave me all the clarity I needed. I smiled gently. "That's why I can't come back." He lowered his head. "I understand." I reached across the bench and took his hand for a brief moment. "Ethan, I forgive you. I truly do. Carrying anger for the rest of my life would only keep hurting me." He looked up hopefully. I continued before he could misunderstand. "But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. The day you walked away from me, you didn't just cancel a wedding. You broke the foundation our relationship was built on. Some things can be repaired. Others become part of your story, but they can never be rebuilt exactly as they were." Tears rolled down his face. "So this is goodbye." I nodded softly. "This is goodbye to us as a couple." I stood and smiled through my own tears. "But it's also goodbye to the woman who spent a year wondering why she wasn't enough. I know now that I always was." Ethan stood too. Without saying another word, he hugged me one final time. It wasn't the embrace of two people starting over. It was the embrace of two people finally letting go. As I walked away, I didn't look back. A year earlier, I would have chased the man I loved. Now, I was walking toward the life I had built for myself. I realized something as I reached my car. The greatest act of self-love isn't finding someone who chooses you. It's refusing to choose someone who once proved they wouldn't choose you. And for the first time in a very long time, I drove home with complete peace in my heart. 2 years have passed since that afternoon by the lake, and I can honestly say it was the best decision I ever made. Walking away from Ethan wasn't easy, but it gave me the chance to discover who I was without constantly putting someone else's dreams ahead of my own. I continued growing in my career, eventually becoming the director of my department. I bought the little house I'd been renting, adopted a rescue dog named Bailey, and filled my home with laughter, friends, and family instead of regrets. My parents often tell me they haven't seen me this happy since I was a little girl, and I think they're right. About a year after saying goodbye to Ethan, I met someone completely unexpected. His name was Daniel, a high school history teacher with an ordinary life, an old pickup truck, and a heart full of kindness. He never tried to impress me with expensive gifts or grand promises. Instead, he showed up when he said he would, remembered the little things that mattered to me, and proved through his actions that loyalty isn't something you talk about, it's something you live every day. For the first time, I understood what real security felt like. It wasn't found in a luxury mansion or a private jet. It was found in knowing the person beside you would still be there when life became difficult. As for Ethan, I heard through mutual friends that he continued working hard, stayed in therapy, and eventually rebuilt a quiet, honest life. I was genuinely happy for him because forgiveness had set both of us free. We simply weren't meant to walk the same path anymore. Sometimes people ask if I ever regret not giving him another chance. My answer is always the same: no. Love deserves forgiveness, but trust must be protected. The version of me who would have taken him back disappeared the day he chose wealth over loyalty. Losing him forced me to become stronger, wiser, and more confident than I ever imagined possible. Looking back now, I realize he didn't ruin my life by canceling our wedding. He saved me from spending the rest of it with someone who didn't truly understand the value of commitment. If you're watching this while your heart is broken because someone chose someone else over you, please remember this: their decision does not define your worth. The right person will never make you compete for a place in their life. Never chase someone who has already shown you they're willing to walk away. Let them go, keep your dignity, and keep moving forward. One day, you'll look back and realize that what felt like the end of your story was actually the beginning of your best chapter. Sometimes the greatest blessing comes disguised as the greatest heartbreak. And that's exactly what happened to me. Thank you so much for watching. If Rachel's story touched your heart or reminded you of the importance of loyalty, self-respect, and knowing your worth, please like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories filled with unforgettable twists, powerful life lessons, and inspiring endings. Your support means the world to us, and we can't wait to share the next story.